time. I'll make this quick so Jonathan can jump into it, but I would like to introduce Jonathan Sarna. Thank you for coming out. Mr. Sarna is currently a, forgive me, hope I get this right, is a professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. Right? Good. To be truthful, I was going to go through as part of this intro to pick out some of the highlights of Mr. Sarna's career, some of his accomplishments. I found his page on the Brandeis University website, and I have to say I was absolutely overwhelmed. So I do encourage any of you who haven't seen it yet to, yeah, I know, it's humble, but it's absolutely amazing. So, but aside from all his accomplishments, we're here to hear Mr. Sarna talk about this book. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Jonathan. It's all yours.
Well, thank you. It's nice to be here, except for an author not to have to get on a plane. I'm just 5 minutes away. It's terrific, and of course it's always a joy to be back here at New England Mobile Book Fair. I have to say that, can you all hear way in the back? Yeah, that the topic of this book really once put my whole academic career in jeopardy. Back in 1982, I was a young starting professor at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and they invited me to give a talk before the institution's board of overseers. As anyone who's been in academia knows, that's a very important rite of passage for a new faculty member to be introduced to the folks who oversee the place. I was naturally determined to prove myself, and since 1982 and the time of the lecture more or less coincided with the 120th anniversary of Ulysses S. Grant's General Orders Number 11, expelling Jews as a class from his war zone, I determined to take that infamous order as my subject. The truth is, Grant's order was the most notorious official act of anti-Semitism in all of American history. It is the only time that Jews as a class have been expelled from anywhere in the United States. And in 1982, new information about that order had become available from the folks publishing the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. So I started preparing the speech, and the day came, and I put on a new suit and came before these august overseers, and everything seemed to be going well until I broached the subject of smuggling. Those who know about Grant know that he was deeply concerned about smuggling between the North and the South, and since some of the smugglers whom his troops caught were Jews, he concluded all Jews were smugglers. And I pointed out that we now know that smuggling was rampant throughout Grant's territory. It was by no means a Jewish monopoly. In fact, I enthusiastically continued, Grant's own father, Jesse Grant, was engaged in a clandestine scheme to move Southern cotton northward, and his partners with the Jewish clothing manufacturer. Chairs began moving uneasily in the room, and my mentor, the pioneering American Jewish historian Jacob Rader Marcus, buried his face in his hands. I knew that I had just said something terrible. I didn't know what it was. I'd done my research. So fearing for the security of my job, I hobbled to the end of the lecture and invited questions. A man in the front row, sitting just about where you were, raised his hand and promptly rose to his feet. "My name is Mac," he memorably began, looking me straight in the eye. He told me that was my great-grandfather that you were talking about, Grant, and then there was a rather long and dramatic pause. It's all true. And at that point, the room relaxed, and Dr. Marcus looked up, and everybody smiled, and my academic career was saved. It took me about 30 years, but when General Grant expelled the Jews, I went back to those notes from 1982 and did a lot more research about the whole story of Ulysses S. Grant and the Jews, and I hope that the story remains full of interest. Now, General Orders number 11, which is dated December the 17th, 1862, this is the 150th anniversary year, read as follows. The Jews as a class, violating every regulation of trade established by the Treasury Department, and also department orders, are hereby expelled from the department within 24 hours from the receipt of this order. We might have expected, in the face of an order like that thousands of Jews would have been evicted from Grant's territory. It was a very large area stretching from northern Mississippi to Cairo, Illinois, from the Mississippi River to the Tennessee River. I have a map in the book. And after all, Memphis alone at that time was one of the largest Jewish communities in the South. But surprisingly, very few Jews were actually expelled. Some from the area just around Holly Springs, where Grant camped, and others, as we will see in a minute, from Paducah, Kentucky. But most Jews, notwithstanding the rather explicit order that I read to you, most Jews remained unaffected. And for a very long time, I wondered why. The answer lies buried in 130 massive volumes, probably not here, known as the Official Record of the War of the Rebellion. They're very rare today. It was a 130-volume set published at the turn of the century. All of them, thank God, are on the internet today, searchable. And by the way, the title hints at who produced the Official Record of the War of the Rebellion, which side. But in any case, if you go through it, what you learn is that less than 72 hours after issuing General Orders number 11, Grant's forces at Holly Springs were surprised by Confederate raiders. Grant was actually far from the scene when it happened, and the commanding officer, a man named Robert C. Murphy, was, according to the official record, quote, out at some entertainment, which made him a trifle over bold, which is a nice way of saying he was stone drunk. Not recommended for commanding officers, and the results were absolutely devastating. Holly Springs surrendered, 1 million rations burned, hundreds of bales of cotton destroyed, 2,000 troops captured, and on, as well as the loss of 50 miles of railroad track, as well as telegraph lines. And it's the telegraph lines that actually are the key to the mystery. Communications between Grant's headquarters and the military command, and indeed all of the surroundings, were disrupted for weeks by those surprise attacks. It took a long time to restore telegraph lines back then, and as a result, news of Grant's order spread very slowly and did not reach the various communities, much less headquarters, in a timely manner, and that spared lots of Jews who might otherwise have been banished. Now, a copy of General Orders number 11 finally reached Paducah, Kentucky. Paducah had been occupied by Grant's forces quite early. early in the war, and it took 11 days to get from Holly Springs to Paducah. There were about 30 Jews living in Paducah at that time. Most of them merchants. They were divided like lots of the Jewish community. Some supported the Confederacy, some the Union. Owing to the war, there was enormous corruption in Paducah. It was a hotbed of smuggling and all sorts of recriminations, and not for the first time under such circumstances, suspicion fell upon the Jews, who, after all, were long stereotyped as being financially unscrupulous. They played, even though small in number, an outsized role in business and trade in Paducah, and they were immigrants, so they were easily marked by their European accents and foreign ways, and the Unionists and the Confederates both doubted their loyalties. So it was that Caesar Caskell, who was actually a strong Union supporter, as well as all of the other known Jews in the city, were handed papers ordering them to leave the city of Paducah, Kentucky within 24 hours. Women and children were expelled too, and in the confusion, so it was recalled years later, one baby was almost forgotten, and 2 dying women had to be left behind in the care of neighbors. Historian Johnny L. Robertson of Paducah preserves a tradition, maybe a bit dubious, that citizens of his city hid some Jews to prevent their being sent away. One soldier, he reports, is said to have knocked on the door of a Jew and demanded, "What are you?" And the resident of the house answered truthfully, "Tailor." To which the not-too-bright soldier replied, "Oh, sorry to bother you, Mr. Taylor. I'm looking for Jews." As they prepared to leave, Caesar Caskell and several other Jews sent a telegram to Abraham Lincoln describing their plight and pronouncing themselves greatly insulted and outraged by this inhuman order, the carrying out of which would be the grossest violation of the Constitution and our rights as good citizens under it. Lincoln probably never saw that telegram. After all, he was busy preparing to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. January the 1st, 1863 is not very long after December 1862, but the irony of his freeing the slaves, just as Grant is expelling the Jews, was not lost on contemporaries. There's actually one paper that printed the 2 documents, Emancipation Proclamation and Grant's order, one above the other, and that juxtaposition also shaped the responses of several Jewish leaders to Grant's order. They feared that Jews might replace blacks as the nation's stigmatized minority in the face of the Emancipation Proclamation. So it's easy to understand why Caesar Caskell wasted no time. On my way to Washington in order to get this most outrageous and inhuman order of Major General Grant countermanded, Caskell announced, and like a kind of latter-day Paul Revere, he rides down to Washington spreading news of General Order Number 11 wherever he went. It's largely due to Caskell, who prepared a press release that most people learned of the order. He arrives in the nation's capital on January 3rd, goes straight to a Republican congressman who had access to the White House, and they go and immediately seek an audience with Abraham Lincoln. It was a very different day. According to the account we have, Lincoln sent word that he's always happy to see his friends and made his appearance. Now, of course, it turned out that Lincoln knew absolutely nothing about General Orders Number 11. because after all, the telegraph lines had been cut. No copy of the order had reached Washington. There is an oft-quoted report of the dialogue between Lincoln and Haskell, which is very interesting, reminds us how well Lincoln knew his Bible and how often 19th century Americans linked Jews to ancient Israel and Americans to the Promised Land. Dialogue goes like this: and so Lincoln is said to have drawled, the children of Israel were driven from the happy land of Canaan. Yes, Haskell cleverly replied, and that is why we have come unto Father Abraham's bosom, seeking protection. And that protection Lincoln is said to have declared they shall have at once. Now, even if the conversation didn't exactly go that way, it was printed 30, 40 years later, Lincoln certainly did instantly instruct the General-in-Chief of the Army, Henry Halleck, to countermand General Orders Number 11. Halleck seems to have had his doubts concerning the authenticity of the original order, so he chose his words very carefully when he wrote to Grant, "If such an order has been issued," his telegram read, "it will be immediately revoked." And that's what happened. A telegram goes out from Grant's headquarters that the general order from these headquarters expelling Jews from the department is hereby revoked. Jewish leaders who had rushed down to Washington in the face of the order have a follow-up meeting with Abraham Lincoln, in which Lincoln reaffirms that he knows of no distinction between Jew and Gentile, and he goes on to say, to condemn a class is, to say the least, to wrong the good with the bad. I do not like to hear a class or nationality condemned on account of a few sinners. So it's an example where Lincoln is every bit as good as one would want him to be. Now that didn't end the controversy, naturally. The Democrats wanted to censure Grant. There's a big debate on the issue in newspapers. The truth is, in retrospect, we know this is not the only human rights violation during the Civil War. I am sure there are quite a number of books here. The subject has become quite popular about other human rights violations. I talk a bit about them in the book. But it is the case that Jews were the only religious minority expelled as a class from a large war zone. Now, there was a fair bit of anti-Semitism during the Civil War, and it was heightened by the prominence of several Jews, notably Jefferson Davis's right-hand man and cabinet member, Judah P. Benjamin, in the ranks of the Confederacy. Senator Benjamin Wade had a marvelous line about Judah Benjamin. He called him an Israelite with Egyptian principles. There was an interesting article on Judah Benjamin this week in Tablet for those who read it. But I don't think the Jewish Confederates were the only cause of prejudice. All sorts of ills in the Civil War, smuggling and speculating and price gouging and swindling and producing shoddy merchandise, all laid on the doorstep of the Jews. Jews in many ways came to personify during the war all of wartime capitalism's ills. In the eyes of a lot of Americans, especially in the military, all traitors and smugglers and wartime profiteers were sharp-nosed Jews, whether they were actually Jewish or not. And the implication, which echoes a well-known canard, is that Jews preferred to benefit from war rather than fight in it. Now, there is no doubt that some Jews did enrich themselves during the war. B'nai B'rith, the Jewish fraternal organization, admitted as much in a secret communication. I was able to go down to the B'nai B'rith papers. They've just been moved to a real archive, but I went down there and I found this secret communication. It's a secret, don't tell anybody, but it read, "Information has been received here, doubtless authentic, proving the fact of certain of our co-religionists being engaged in an illegal traffic and other acts of disloyalty with those who are in rebellion against the government." But if the cause of Grant's order was that he identified a widespread practice, meaning smuggling, with a visible group, the Jews, and blamed Jews as a class for what was in fact an inevitable product of wartime shortages exploited by Jews and non-Jews, civilians and military men alike, there was tremendous smuggling during the war. What the mystery that remains is, why was the order issued on December the 17th, 1862? Why then? And it's especially mysterious because a man named John Van Dusen Du Bois, who was a colonel, had expelled all cotton speculators, Jews, and other vagrants from a much more limited area just a few weeks earlier, and Grant had angrily overturned the order. So why does he expel the Jews on December the 17th? And the answer to that question brings us back to my opening story. We now know that in mid-December of 1862, Grant received a visit from his 68-year-old father, Jesse Grant, accompanied by members of the very prominent Mack family of Cincinnati, who were significant clothing manufacturers, and of course, if you were a clothing manufacturer, you needed cotton. The Macks, as part of an ingenious scheme, had formed a secret partnership with the somewhat shady elder Grant. They offered him 25% of the profits, and he agreed to accompany them to his son's headquarters. As you know, the father, he would get passes allowing them to move cotton from the south to the north, would help them ship the cotton to New York, and he'd collect 25% of the profits. Now, in real life, the relationship between Grant and his father was not a particularly good one. He craved his father's approval, but winced at many of the old man's shortcomings. And according to an eyewitness, Ulysses waxed indignant at his father's crass attempt to profit from his son's military status, and raged at the Jewish traders who entrapped his father in such an unworthy undertaking. He didn't provide the permit. He sent the Jews, the Macks, northward on the first train, and in high dudgeon immediately issued the order expelling Jews as a class from his war zone. If I were a psychohistorian, I would suggest that he expelled the Jews instead of his father. Now, actually, Grant never made public mention of his father's corrupt scheme with the Macks. He never defended himself. He didn't even mention it in his justly celebrated memoirs. I'm sure the memoirs are here. They are the finest military memoirs, certainly in American history, Grant's memoirs. Really extraordinary, but they don't make any mention of General Orders Number 11, and that is not an accident. According to Grant's son, Frederick, who helped him with the memoirs, remember Grant was dying and he writes these memoirs, and Frederick said he asked his father about the order, shouldn't we say something? And Grant said, that was a matter long past and best not referred to. But Julia Dent Grant, who is Grant's wife, she was much less circumspect. You perhaps know that sometimes what husbands seek to forget, their wives like to remember. And in this case, in her memoirs, perhaps there is a copy here, she went out of her way to mention General Orders Number 11, which she characterized as nothing less than, quote, obnoxious. The general, she recalled, felt that the severe reprimand he received for the order was deserved, for he had no right to make an order against any special sect. Now, maybe if Grant had himself said that back in 1863, the whole course of his relationship with the Jewish community would have been different. But as it was, he found himself compared in Jewish circles to historic enemies of the Jewish people, a rather long and ignoble list. The most common comparison was actually to Haman. And you know, everyone knew the biblical book of Esther, and they thought that Grant played that role. And that comparison to Haman came back to haunt Grant when he ran for president in 1868. And really, thanks to his Democratic opponents, who used the order to try and win Jewish votes, General Order Number 11 became a very important election year issue in 1868. That is the very first time that a Jewish issue has ever been front and center in an American election campaign. The problem for a lot of Jews was that they choked at the thought of voting for Ulysses S. Grant, yes, Haman, but they actually strongly supported his Republican Party's policies on Reconstruction. The Democrats, after all, were eager to reverse Reconstruction-era laws and to disenfranchise black voters altogether. And the liberal Jews, at least, who supported Republican policies, faced a very difficult conundrum. And that conundrum was, should they vote for a party they considered bad for the country, meaning the Democrats, just in order to avoid voting for a man who had been bad to the Jews, meaning Ulysses S. Grant. There is a big debate in the Jewish press between rabbis who support Grant and rabbis who oppose him. I'll leave you that to read in the book. Suffice it to say that when the votes were tallied, Grant emerged the winner by a quite healthy 300,000 vote majority. The Jewish vote, most of the pundits greatly exaggerated the Jewish vote. There can't even have been 100,000 Jewish votes at that time. They still greatly exaggerate the size and significance of the Jewish vote. It certainly didn't make any difference in the election. But once the election is over, and nobody can accuse Grant of currying favor with any group, he issues an unprecedented letter that actually tells Jews what they want to hear. I mean, in the whole of Jewish history, we have almost no letters of apology. Ferdinand and Isabella never sent an apology, but Grant does. I have no prejudice or against sect or race, but want each individual to be judged on his own merit. Order number 11 does not sustain this statement, I admit, but then I do not sustain that order. Jews took that as an apology, but what is deeply significant and surprising is that during Grant's presidency, he goes out of his way to prove that apology genuine. He appoints more Jews to public office than all previous presidents combined, including a governor of Washington Territory, a superintendent of Indian Affairs. He's actually the very first president who has a Jewish advisor, an advisor on Jewish affairs, Simon Wolf. He's also the first president to attend a synagogue dedication. He goes to the dedication of Adas Israel in Washington, at the time an Orthodox synagogue, and he sits there for a full 3 hours in the Washington heat. That's real penance while that dedication is going on. More significantly, he intervenes on behalf of persecuted Jews in Russia and Romania, actually appoints a Jewish consul to Romania, whose sole mission is to aid his fellow Jews laboring under severe oppression. And I say much more about that in the book. Really, no one had ever before looked at his career, and it's perfectly clear that he consciously was appointing Jews in order to overcome the impression that he was an anti-Semite. Indeed, the years of Grant's presidency represented something of a golden age for American Jews, a brief period in which they achieved heightened status on the national scene, won recognition as a faith co-equal to Catholicism and Protestantism, an era when anti-Jewish prejudice declined, and Jews looked forward to a liberal epoch characterized by sensitivity to human rights and interreligious cooperation. In many ways, the logic of Reconstruction, which was a kind of second founding, shaped this golden age. The same policies and values that opened up all sorts of opportunities for black Americans during the late 60s and early 1870s likewise extended new opportunities to Jews. Now, following his presidency, Grant travels around the world. He's the first president to visit the land of Israel, and on several occasions he reinforces his support for Jews, even though he's not running for public office. Yes, so it's not just politics. And when he dies in 1885, the same week as the greatest Jew in the world at that time, Sir Moses Montefiore of England, the two men are linked together in the American Jewish mind as heroes and humanitarians. They are mourned together in many synagogues. Yes, what a change from 2 decades earlier. Now, subsequently, Grant's reputation, of course, sank like a stone. 20th century historians, many of them were deeply critical of his benevolent policies towards African Americans, the so-called Dunning School of American History, bitterly criticized Grant in any number of ways. Most of you learned that in school. He was drunk, he killed a lot of people. They ranked him close to the bottom among all of American presidents. At one point, only Warren G. Harding ranked lower than Grant. You can't get much lower than that. And so, not surprisingly, Jews joined in that outpouring of criticism. And standard Jewish histories just quote General Orders Number 11 and don't tell you about what happened when he was president. If you look even at the new edition of the Encyclopedia Judaica, it tells you Grant's name has been linked irrevocably with anti-Jewish prejudice. But I think a re-examination of Grant's career, which I've tried to do here, makes clear that he deserved better. Grant's transformation from enemy to friend, from Haman to Mordecai, from a general who expelled Jews as a class to a president who embraced Jews as individuals, reminds us that even great figures in history can learn from their mistakes, hatred can be overcome. Thanks very much. If there are questions, please.
How extensive was his administration's friendship to the Jews? Not just his, but his administration's.
Well, I mean, the administration certainly took its bidding from Grant. What interested me particularly, I talk a lot about the Grant administration, were these two moments when Jews are persecuted abroad. Now, in American foreign policy, you had not much wanted to get involved. So look at Buchanan when, during the Mortara affair, a Jew is kidnapped. America doesn't want to get involved. Of course, America didn't want to get involved for a simple reason. Buchanan said, how can I get involved in the kidnapping of a child in Italy? Maybe they'll come and criticize us. We also, he knew, sell children and kidnap them, you know, and sell them down the river. And moreover, Russia, which is one of the countries where Jews were being persecuted, had just sold America Alaska. So you had every reason for not intervening, and I'm sure, I know it because one can read it in the documents, the State Department had very little interest in pursuing this issue. But Grant does pursue it, and he is widely credited, whether he's accurately credited or whether there were other reasons why they didn't expel Jews from an area of Bessarabia is irrelevant. He's credited with stepping in, and he says all the right things. And when Jews are persecuted in Romania, the same thing. He intervenes in an unprecedented way, and I actually argue that the roots of human rights policy is still controversial. Yes, should we intervene in Syria on the basis of human rights or not? But the roots of human rights policy as part of American foreign policy go to Grant, and it's really in this case of Jews being persecuted. So I was pretty impressed with what happened during his presidency. But a great question. Other? Please.
Given Grant's background, is it safe to assume that he didn't have large personal experience of Jews?
It's also a good question. It's safe to assume. It seems that he had known a couple of Jews, but it's not clear to me that he knew they were Jews. The most famous Jew he knew prior to the Civil War were the Seligmans, later famous bankers. That they'd been in the same area when they had a little store. Whether he knew they were Jewish is not clear, but it's certainly no evidence that he knew a lot about Jews. Remember, America's Jewish population is growing very, very quickly. There are maybe 15,000 Jews in America in 1840. There are 150,000 in 1860. So new immigrants tend to live on their own. They look different. You don't become aware of them. You're not befriending them so quickly. And so my sense is he didn't know much about Jews, and actually only gets to know Jews partly as a result of General Order Number 11, and more significantly, in the war's wake, a lot of Jews, like Simon Wolf, had moved to Washington or had gotten involved in the Republican Party. Abraham Lincoln had some significant Jewish friends, like the Jonases, and Grant begins to meet Jews whom he's actually very impressed with, people like himself who had worked themselves up from nothing, people who he can respect. And I think it very much changed his views. And I think the order itself and kind of the spanking that he got from Abraham Lincoln, who says, I judge people as individuals and not as a class, certainly was internalized. And you can see Grant using almost that language, not only for Jews, but in terms of blacks, in terms of Native Americans, if we then called Indians, he similarly makes the case they should be judged as individuals. So I do think he internalized it. Okay, yeah.
I have a very simple question. When he expelled, where did he expect them
Where
to
did
go?
he go to? That's good. The assumption was that they were going to go outside his war zone. The boat took them eventually to Cincinnati, to Louisville. All of that was outside. They, in theory, could have gone east or west. Almost all of them went east. That also took them away from the war zone, and the assumption was, if you're not at the war zone, you're not going to smuggle. Smuggling takes place in border areas, and a classic way to prevent smuggling is to move people away from border areas. Yeah?
Was anything done after the war with smugglers of all kinds and other war criminals?
You know, after the war, it became a kind of mark of pride, since so many people smuggled, and it was so much money could be made from smuggling. You could make 400% on your money moving cotton from south to north and moving food and medical supplies from north to south. That people did it, and almost everybody who could tried, and later, after the war, lots of them boasted of their success. There, any night, quote some of them, Jews and non-Jews, any number of memoirs in which people talk about how they cleverly got around the embargo and what they did and so on. That often happens just as people boast about how they smuggled Jews into Palestine in the face of the British. So later on, a lot of people wrote about it with pride. Everybody who could did. Yeah.
Well, the smuggling was pretty much national entertainment, because it was before revolution.
I'm going to come back in here. Was the smuggling?
Smuggling was like pastime, national pastime, because before revolution we have Hancock.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of.
That's why the revolution started.
Well, I mean, I don't know how many people in the Civil War knew about the revolution, but you're at wartime. It's, look, whenever you have an embargo and an opportunity to make a lot of money through smuggling, and you have an enemy and so on, people are going to do it. Plenty of money was made in Iraq in our day, or now in Iran, through smuggling. It's a kind of the oldest story in the book, and in this case, so many people had relatives north and south, and that it was pretty easy to go and visit your relatives and carry things along, and a lot of them did. But Jews, as I say, were visible. They looked different. It may be that Jews who were merchants were particularly successful in smuggling. Lots of them, a certain number were caught, and a lot of people stereotyped them and stigmatized them, overlooking the fact, which is recognized later, that pretty well anybody who could did. And by the way, we know that lots of soldiers smuggled, because this was a way of making money, adding to your fortune while you were in the military. And quite a few generals, Butler, for example, got his brother to do the smuggling for him. He entered the war rather poor and emerged from the war rather rich, and some of that had to do with what he did. Yeah?
A couple of questions.
Yeah.
When you mentioned the Mack affair,
Yeah.
were they any relation to Judge Julian Mack?
Yes, it's exactly good. It's the same family. It's a big family, and Judge Julian Mack is from the same family. He, of course, later moves to Chicago, and the family is divided. Yes, Mack is a Zionist, some of the others are not, but it's the same family. I believe that Cintas, the uniform company, is a descendant of the Mack business.
And as a follow-up to that,
Uh-huh.
weren't the 1870s and 80s a period of restorationism in terms of Israel and certain Christian sects advocated? Was Grant at all familiar with the early Zionist?
Well, I wouldn't. I mean, the word Zionism doesn't exist.
Didn't exist yet, but
You have some. I mean, Christian restorationism you can find earlier than that. You can find in the 1840s. Talk of it. America has long been deeply, messianic, and people thought that from America would come forth the millennium. Michael Oren's big book that is here has some of those stories. You will find some. There's no evidence that Grant is interested in that. Indeed, he's read Mark Twain's book, about his travels to the Holy Land, and he privately agreed with him. That is, he didn't much enjoy his trip to the land of Israel. You won't find that in any of the books that are published about Grant's travels, because, it was unseemly to say you went to the Holy Land and didn't like it. But if you read his correspondence, it actually snowed while he was visiting Israel, and even now the whole place, they don't know what to do with snow, and it's hard to get around. And in the 19th century, it must have been horrible. And he wrote there that he was glad to leave, just like Mark Twain in Innocents Abroad is glad to leave. But that's the difference between reading private correspondence and reading the public travelogues. It's a case where you'd get an absolutely opposite view of his trip from the private to the public. I wouldn't exaggerate Grant's religiosity in these ways, but certainly there were people in America who were. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Yes. Were you surprised by Grant the man as you were researching this? The change that he went through from...
Yes. Was I surprised? Yes. I was not aware. None of the books that deal with Grant really talk about it. If you read, there are many wonderful books on Grant, biographies, and most of them devote a paragraph, maybe a page, to General Order Number 11, and the more recent books, which are positive towards Grant, like this wonderful Smith biography, which I'm sure is here, basically say, oh, but he had this blind spot when it came to Jews, meaning that she hasn't really looked into the matter. So the only hint I had was in the autobiography of Simon Wolfe. Simon Wolfe loved Grant, and people had not, paid too much attention to that, but yeah, I came to the conclusion that Wolfe was really right, and I think we've also forgotten how popular Grant was in his own day. When Grant dies, he's compared to Washington and Lincoln, and people assume it's Washington, Lincoln, Grant are the greatest three Americans. It's amazing how your reputation can fall. Nobody would ever imagine that today. And that, I think, is why, when he dies, Jews join in this outpouring of love for Grant, and I was amazed at how much was said and so on. They did remember General Order Number 11, but they all said, oh, but, he atoned for it, and what a great man. But later on, all of that is forgotten, and I was glad to restore to life a kind of forgotten chapter in the history of Grant with Jews. And from the point of view, I'm waiting to see if any of the Grant scholars review the book. I've had the great Lincoln scholar gave it a very good review, but what I'm basically saying is that they've missed an important theme in Grant's life, that he spends the years following his election kind of atoning for General Order Number 11, and you cannot really understand some of Grant's actions unless you see that he is trying to prove that he's not the kind of person who expels Jews as a class, that he wants to erase this stain on his record. So thanks very much for coming out. You've been a great audience, and I'm going to enjoy the book.
For those of you who either have books that you would like to have